I've always been a full-spectrum constitutional Christian conservative, always anchored on the text of the Constitution and of course, its original intent. And I've defended those things all along the way. So the people that are promoting this CO2 pipeline understood that. They saw the positions that I had taken. For example, when the Kelo decision came down in 2006, and just to remind people of that, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." That's pretty clear. There's no eminent domain unless it's for public use with just compensation, and by the way, due process. The city of New London, Connecticut, had developed an economic development plan, put it on paper and said, we want all of this land out here, and we're going to take all these houses out, these residences out, and we're going to build a pill factory, a pharmaceutical factory. And they then took possession of and condemned Suzette Kelo's property and that of her neighbors, and then handed it over, prepared at least to hand it over to the developers. Well, so that's government confiscating private property for a private use under the justification or the excuse that they had an economic development plan that was a better public purpose, a higher public purpose than property rights. That was the rationale of the 5 members of the United States Supreme Court. And John Paul Stevens, Justice Stevens, wrote the majority opinion that says that he added extra word to that, nor shall private property be taken for public use or public purpose without just compensation. He effectively put those words into the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. So a public purpose can be defined about any way you want to define a public purpose. And that weakened our property rights dramatically. When that came down, I had more hair then, it was all on fire. And we immediately wrote a resolution that rejected the Kelo decision. And the next day, we brought this resolution to the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, a resolution of disapproval of the Supreme Court's split decision, 5-4 decision on the Kelo decision. But my public record against Kelo has been strong, and I've spoken against it consistently ever since, because I knew that it was undermining our right to property and taking the foundation out from underneath our free enterprise system. And you don't have free enterprise without property rights. So this goes deep in me, and it should go deep within everybody that's ever studied the Constitution and the history of Western civilization, especially the United States of America. You know, when you give an oath to the Constitution, you put your left hand on the Bible, you raise your right hand, and then you pledge to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help you God, you'd better say. And this is the posture, because that way you can't have your fingers crossed behind your back when you take that oath. But I must think that they all did. None of them have taken a position to explain their position on the Fifth Amendment and the constitutional property rights. And so not Randy Feenstra here, not the other 3 members of the delegation, and the legislative leadership in Iowa that has deep sixed any legislation that would have had a chance to save our constitutional rights, have all been killed in the Iowa Senate. And it only takes 2 or 3 people to kill a bill like this in the Iowa Senate. And by the way, the bills that got killed in the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, same thing, the Senate. And the reason is you only need to influence, I put that in air quotes, half as many people in the Senate than you do in the House. So the House is more responsive to we the people, the Senate is more responsive to they the lobby. But this constitutional piece of this is hanging in the balance now, and you can go from the Kelo decision to what amounts to is this, that there was a time we talked about public-private partnerships, and as the founder of King Construction, we've been engaged in those. We built a park in one of the towns that's close to me. We wanted to help the community out. That's public-private partnership. But now it's the other way around. It's a private-public partnership, and the oligarchs are running government to get government to do what they want them to do. And so to take this whole thing back to its beginnings, I can trace the World Economic Forum's involvement in this clear back to 2011. And it probably was before that. But they actually acknowledge it in certain ways that 2011 was kind of the beginning. They think, so roughly speaking, you'll see people say, 15 years ago we started to plan for this. And I spent a lot of time traveling in and out of Europe as a delegate to the OCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, and 57 member nation states. And there you get delegates from all over, and there you find a way to identify with people of like mind. And throughout all of that, I found myself debating with the people that are promoting this. But I'm watching as the World Economic Forum is convincing the European Union that this is the way to go. I saw the foundation, the political and the scientific, that's also in air quotes, foundation laid down throughout those years, starting probably back before then, I guess it goes back another 10 years prior to that, when this global warming thing emerged. And when I was elected to Congress, I went to the floor of Congress, and well, Ed Markey's out on the floor telling us all about cap and trade. We have to embrace cap and trade. Well, cap and trade became carbon credits, became the, and by the way, it became the Build Back Better plan. That was something that was cooked up by the World Economic Forum at a meeting they did in Japan in 2015. They injected that language into this discussion, Build Back Better. Well, then that became Joe Biden's mantra from his basement, Build Back Better. And that was in AOC, of course, embraced the Build Back Better and then turned it into the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal that's tied to the Build Back Better plan that goes all the way back to Ed Markey's cap and trade, that goes all the way back to the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, and selling this to the European Union and convincing Angela Merkel and other leaders across Europe, this is how we're going to save the planet. And instead, it's how they're set up a global currency. So the politics of this was driven to us out of the World Economic Forum, rooted at least, I'll say, till 2011, but probably before that. And they have matured their plan along the way too. I mean, it wasn't like this is set in stone, this is what we will do. They adjust it as time moves on, with politics, etc. So I'll just take you to here now in the heart of the heartland. And when Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, that triggered the $85 45Q credit for sequestering a metric ton of carbon. And when that happened, it looked to me like the oligarchs, the big business people, and Larry Fink and his BlackRock investment firm controlling at least $10 trillion, they were all ready to go. They were set up. You know, when they had the Oklahoma land rush over 100 years ago, they fired a pistol at noon, and the honest people had their wagons ready, and the Sooners were already there. And that was the Larry Finks and the Bruce Rastetters and these other oligarchs. They already were on the inside track of this thing. So when Biden signed that bill, they were ready to go. And their plan was 3,600 miles of pipeline to collect, in the end, about 57 or more, it was actually more, 60-some ethanol plants altogether. And that's, so when you look at that network, the original maps that came down, 280 miles of it was going to be Archer Daniels Midlands, taking CO2 from one of their plants on the west side of the Mississippi over to southern Illinois on the east side of the Mississippi, and then pumping that down into the oil fields. That was a small one that they never really tried for eminent domain. The other two pipeline plans was the one that is Summit, that's run by Bruce Rastetter, who is the, what should I call him, the Republican George Soros of the upper Midwest. And that's the Republican side of this thing. But Navigator and Larry Fink, that's the blue guys. They fly the blue flag. They're the Democrats. They're the lefties. And so this is more Larry Fink's brainchild, I think, than it ever was Bruce Rastetter's. But when he looked at this and they laid out their strategy, what was taking place was, when they realized they had to have eminent domain, they probably didn't know these landowners don't give up this land, and they came to the place where they knew they had to have eminent domain, and they weren't making the progress with selling their easements that they thought they would. But it was because Bruce Rastetter, the Summit operation, the Republicans, his plan was, I say his assignment even out of the World Economic Forum was, you go blaze the trail with your pipelines, and the other half of them will come into the jet stream of that and just lock on and stream. Larry Fink and Navigators will stream right on through them once you clear the path. But you have to clear the path because there's a Republican governor in North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and Iowa. And by the way, their legislatures are controlled, all branches, by Republicans, which are controlled by the leadership, not the membership. And so Bruce Rastetter had been involved in all of those political campaigns. The governors of the Dakotas and Nebraska and Iowa, and the leadership, the top leadership, I'm not talking about necessarily the whip or the assistant leader, but the speaker, the majority leader, generally speaking, or the president of the Senate and the majority leader in the Senate. He's had significant influence in all other races, and there's money in all the races that I can see. And so he had cleared the path politically, even though it's there's several legitimate polls that have been run out on this. The Des Moines Register did one a year and a half ago, and they had 78% of the public opposed eminent domain for this pipeline because they know it's for private gain. 78%, and that wasn't, and when you broke it down, what the percentage of Democrats, no party, and Republicans, and you break it down by age group, it all matched out 78% across the board. Universal, I've never seen anything like that, where a universal opposition to eminent domain for private gain. And so when you've got an issue like that and it's contentious and you can't prevail in the legislature, I can't think of another issue in my long political life that ever it came to the point where something that should have been a slam dunk, non-controversial, as we say, instead, you can't get anything passed that protects property rights. In fact, they're passing things that erode our property rights. And the only reason for that has to be the powerful influence that, I'll say, Bruce Rastetter, it's not only his money, but it's the influence. And it's the cutthroat approach that he brings to things. Legislators are afraid of him. So with that kind of control that Bruce Rastetter had over the governors and I'll say the relevant legislative top leadership, he could kill any bill that threatened his agenda. And so, but that was, I believe, was Bruce Rastetter's charge with Summit was to clear the path for Navigator and Larry Fink. So when Larry Fink pulled the plug, I think realizing that they were not going to get the job done, then Bruce Rastetter's Summit said, oh, we're perfectly positioned to pick up these plants that Navigator has now pulled out of. Was that a deal in advance or not? I don't know if we'll ever know. Maybe it wasn't completely decided, but it surely was convenient. So now you have 57 ethanol plants that supposedly have contracts to sell their CO2 to Summit and Bruce Rastetter. He would gather all of this up together and then pump it up to North Dakota, theoretically pump it down into the formations up there, and to a saltwater sand bucket is how it's described to me from the geologists up there. And it's 2,200 pounds pressure, this CO2, this supercritical CO2 that's kind of a liquid and kind of a gas. And to get it down 6,000 feet, you've got to take that 2,200 pounds pressure, which, by the way, that's the pressure in a hydraulic hose and a backhoe or an excavator or a bulldozer or anything. If one of these CO2 pipelines gets a release, it will blow. And there'll be CO2 all over the place. And it's heavier than air. And it displaces anything around it. And for example, in our hog, we used to call them now harvesting facilities. It used to be slaughter plants, but we had to do it in humane fashion. And so now we put about 16 to 20 of them in an elevator, roll them down a shaft that's loaded with CO2. You just fill it with CO2 or half full, take the hogs down in below that, leave them down there for a minute and a half, bring them back up again, they're all dead. So we use CO2 to euthanize hogs for slaughter. And so the starkest story I know, and you probably heard people talk about Satartia, and I won't go into that and double that, but Lake Nyas in Cameroon. Lake Cameroon is a West Africa small country, and they had a lake there, actually a couple lakes that this happened in, but this particular lake was Lake Nyas, N-Y-O-S. In 1986, there was a natural burp of CO2 that came up out of the bottom of that lake, whatever caused that to happen. And that CO2 then went out across the lake because it'll go seek its lowest level. Well, that's where the water is. So it'll follow the water surface. It spread out across that lake, and then the outlet of the lake went down a valley. And there were 2 or 3 villages down along that valley. And when it did, it killed between 1,700 and 2,000 people right where they were. And there they were, that 1,700, 2,000 people dead in their tracks, just like all of a sudden everybody dropped dead, which is what happened. And the fellow that I listened to the interview from, he walked in there after the air had cleared. And he said it was the eeriest thing because we had all of that death and there was not the buzzing of a single fly. It even killed all the flies. Everything living that breathes is dead when it's surrounded by CO2. So Summit has, let's say this comes from Navigator, Larry Fink's operation. They haven't admitted to any kind of they call it a plume study. But the terrific Cindy Golding, state representative from Iowa, has labeled it instead the kill zone. And she's right on it. There's not a reason to be worried about where it goes if it's not the kill zone. It is the kill zone. And so Navigator had it set up that, well, they admitted to this publicly, that the plume area, or the kill zone, would be 1,855 feet either side of the pipeline. And I'm not sure what size that is, 6 or 8 inch or something. But I know enough about hydrology and elevations and science to know that you can't just draw a line parallel to the pipeline and keep that CO2 within that. It's going to follow with, and by the way, the colder the temperature is, the higher the concentration of CO2 for the longest period of time. And the wind direction matters, like a little breeze here today. Well, CO2 would be following across the grass, going downwind from us and downhill if it can find the place to do it. And so what we need is a dynamic study of the plume study kill zone. And that study would be a lot about like a floodplain zone study, where you start out with the lowest elevations next to the pipeline. Say if there's a rupture here, then where's this gas go? What's downhill? What are the elevations? What are the volume within those contour lines? And what's the temperature? Which direction does the wind go? And we have the scientific capability to do an interactive map. And they have described this, a 24-inch pipe with valves 20 miles apart. That's 2 million gallons of CO2, liquid CO2. No, excuse me, it's 1 million gallons. 1 million gallons of liquid CO2, but if you rupture this thing at a valve, now you've got 2 million gallons of CO2. And that's the most likely place to be sabotaged, by the way, but they won't tell us the plume study from Summit because it's a national security issue, because after all, you know, we can't let the Chinese find out where it is. They might send some of their fifth column to go detonate a 1.25 pounds of C4 on a valve. And I have a picture of the valves they designed. They come out of the ground, about 4 foot above the ground, horizontal, valve here, goes back in the ground. And there's about a 6 foot tall chain link fence around them, and you can see them from the road. So, you know, that stuff's not ever going to be a secret. This isn't, wherever this pipeline goes is not going to be a secret. The plume study, they wanted a secret because they don't want to be shut down because of the high risk of this. The lack of a plume study, and by the way, the lack of the PHMSA study that is supposedly pending, we don't have federal regulations for safety on these pipelines. That's PHMSA's responsibility, a division of the Department of Transportation. And that's not done. They thought it might happen sometime fairly soon, I guess, but Illinois has passed a moratorium on all CO2 sequestration, and one of the conditions is, unless and until PHMSA comes out with a safety regulations that would regulate it. That's not the only thing, that's one of the conditions. But we don't have that, and they're saying that if Summit moves forward, that they're grandfathered in and will not have to comply with new safety regulations as soon as they start 1 foot of construction of the pipeline. Then there's safety regulations that exist today, which are essentially they're not written for a CO2 pipeline. Nothing is written federally for safety regulations for a CO2 pipeline. They would be operating underneath the non-existent CO2 regulations for safety. So we have property rights that are, the bulldozers lined up to bulldoze through the best farmland in the world and destroy the property rights in the process. And the safety of this thing is set aside, kicked aside, declared to be a national secret. When I labeled Bruce Rastetter the Republican George Soros of the Upper Midwest, I've been on the positive side of Bruce Rastetter too. And I know how that side of his machinery works. Yeah, and there was a time when he's raised some money for me and put together some events for me. And I always took that as an expression of an endorsement of my judgment and gratitude for what I have done. Turns out that I was unintentionally copied on an email between his chief of staff and himself some years ago now, about 2013 or 14 or something, that said, well, it looks like King didn't get the message. It was on immigration. So we're going to have to send him another message. And I can just remember certain looks and certain words that told me what was going on. This shift was taking place. How is the CO2 pipeline going to save ethanol? Yeah, that's the pitch that they started from the beginning. This is going to save ethanol. Bruce Rastetter came to one particular plant that I have in mind, and he made the offer. He said, I will take that CO2 off your hands, no charge. and also negotiated for a share of the 45Z, which probably doesn't materialize anymore, but that was going to pay up to $1 a gallon to subsidize ethanol if they could qualify for it in time and reduce their carbon index. And so that pitch was made to ethanol plant after ethanol plant, that you're going to make money off of 45Z, and I'll take the CO2 off your hands. And however, each one of these contracts were negotiated presumably differently. And he also sold it to the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, and that's the people that promote ethanol and biodiesel. So they started to promote this idea that we needed to be sequestering CO2, and that was going to save the ethanol industry, which was going to collapse if we didn't do something. And that came right on the cusp of the most profitable years ever for the ethanol business. They're telling us ethanol is going to go broke if we don't do this. And their argument is, well, we can't sell ethanol into California if we don't meet their carbon index standard. So they were regulations that were designed to lock corn ethanol out of the California ethanol market and give preference to sugarcane ethanol that comes out of usually Brazil, a little bit of the United States, but Brazil. California is regulating the method and means of production of a product that's traded in interstate commerce. Well, isn't that a violation of the Commerce Clause, where that regulation is exclusively the territory of the United States Congress? That is an enumerated power. So we're supposedly going to save ethanol by being able to crack into the California market, who will change the rules on it as soon as we might be able to crack into their market. And that's one of the reasons they say, well, we're save the ethanol industry by bringing in all these subsidies up to $1 a gallon, and of course the subsidy for the CO2. So why wouldn't you protect property rights? And why wouldn't you let the markets determine this? And why would you want to set up a business that's dependent solely upon government subsidy? And that's what Bruce Rastetter and Summit has done, is set up, and this needs to be said, is that if he succeeds in this, in connecting 57 ethanol plants, the lion's share of the ethanol plants here in the Corn Belt, the Corn Belt, if he succeeds in that, he's established a quasi-monopoly to control the CO2, which is a third of every bushel of corn, and it's the largest mass of the purest form of CO2, at least that I know of, anywhere in the world. And so he will have secured a quasi-monopoly from all of those 57 ethanol plants, which is, again, the lion's share of them. If he does that, he's going to control these markets. And the federal government has a floor price for that CO2 built in at $85 a metric ton. So if he can get it done and pump this into that saltwater sand bucket up there at 6,000 feet at 3,000 pounds pressure in North Dakota, and trust the Earth's not going to rupture someplace because it's got to displace it, if he can do that, he's guaranteed no less than $85. And yet you've got Harold Hamm as an investor in this operation. He's the founder of fracking, and he's operating in North Dakota. So if Harold Hamm wants to offer the company Summit $86, then it'll go for fracking. So thinking about this quasi-monopoly, hereafter referred to as monopoly, the $85 floor price, guaranteed price, no less than 85. And then we've got all these industrial uses for it that have emerged. Methanol, green jet fuel, and we've been pushing and promoting the idea of producing methanol at the ethanol plants, which nullifies the need for a pipeline. And there's a global market that's really growing for methanol. For example, Maersk, the largest container ship company in the world, has announced that they can take all of the methanol we can produce from 40 different ethanol plants to just power their ships on the high seas. So, and that's driven out of the European Union. That is said, by X date, 2030 or maybe shortly thereafter, you will not be able to dock your ships at any of the ports of the European Union unless you meet our carbon credits or our carbon index standard. And then you can also convert to, you've got CO2 and methanol and ethanol, then you can convert that to the green jet fuel, the sustainable aviation fuel. And that's, of course, a big demanded market, because these airlines now are going to raise the price of our tickets dramatically in order to get their carbon index down. So all of this push is a push that came from the brainchild of Klaus Schwab, Larry Fink, and others out of the World Economic Forum, spread across the European Union, spread into the Democratic Party here in the United States. 20 or more years ago, they were already pounding away on this mantra. And then signed by Joe Biden, and now here it is, hundreds of billions of dollars. So we have an economy that's driven and propped up by just government subsidies, deficit spending government subsidies. We're financing our own destruction, and the infrastructure for the pipeline, that's more taxpayers paying for that. And so how does this work? Let's see. You run the national debt to 35 trillion more. When we have to borrow that money internationally, well, about half of it's from the American people, by the way. The other half comes from the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Chinese. And so let's see this. We borrow money from China to pay the interest and the bonds that we borrow from China for, and then China collects the interest on the money we borrow from them, and so they're making money off of as a lender to the to Uncle Sam. And not only that, but there's massive Chinese investment in this summit operation. And two of them you don't need to ask the questions about, and that is the Smithfield is large packing industry, is 100% Chinese owned. They came in and bought that company up, and then you've got Syngenta, another company, a seed and chemical company, 100% Chinese owned. So those two companies are on the website of Summit, partners, along with John Deere and several others, LS2, the large lobbying firm, and so we're supposed to keep this pipeline location and plume study a secret so the Chinese don't find out. But I have a feeling that their members on the board already know where all this is going. But think of that, the Chinese are double dipping into this deal. They're investors with Summit, and they'll cash in on the dividends there if this is built. And at the same time, we're borrowing money to pay these credits from China, so we'll pay them interest and principal, and our children and grandchildren get to pick up the bill. It's the largest boondoggle I have ever seen or read about in history, and it's got a global reach. Let me say another piece of this for people, for helping them comprehend what this is. Carbon credits have now become a de facto global currency. If you're doing business and the European Union says you don't get to dock at this port unless you reach our carbon index, you can reach that by buying the carbon credits. Well, so Bruce Rastetter and Summit, if they sequester that CO2 up there, that's that. But they can either do that or they can take carbon credits back instead of a check from the federal government. So if the carbon credits are worth more than $85, he'll hold the carbon credits. If he wants to sell them to Harold Hamm for fracking, he can do that. If the global market is such that he can sell those carbon credits to Maersk, for example, and they don't convert from diesel as fast as they think, they can just say, oh yeah, our carbon index is down because we bought these billions of dollars worth of carbon credits, so let me dock my ships at your port. Right. And that would work. Now, that's an international currency, a de facto currency for any corporation that's large enough for them to bother to look in on you. Now look at all the markets he has. He's got a floor price, $85 from the government guarantee. He can sell credits any place he wants to. He can sell the CO2 off for fracking, and he's now become a globalist that would be controlling the lion's share of the CO2, which is the purest form and perhaps the largest mass of any known anywhere in the world. Wow. And we fund it. The chairman of the board is Eric Helland of the Iowa Utilities Commission, who's been making draconian decisions, and who was the one holdout that said, we need to give Summit the authority to start this pipeline now. Never mind whether they've got permission to go through South Dakota or Nebraska, but that's this guy. He's the guy that 3 times has denied me the right, even under their own rules, to testify before the Utilities Board. And the last time, and just to speak of it, Carol had just had a heart procedure and asked me to testify on her behalf. She was scheduled to testify before the board and asked me to testify on her behalf because of that. And I spent some time preparing for that. And she called ahead and told him, okay, that's fine. I walked in there, they expected me, they handed me a little tag that says witness, put around my neck. I got to sit in a special spot, and they called for the witness for the Hennings Family Trust. I went up there and sat down, and Eric Helland, the chairman, looked at me and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm here to represent," and he just cut me off. He knew what I was going to say. I think I got out Hennings Family Trust, but he was interrupting me as I was saying that. And then he said, I said, "She has had," he said, "We know." He knew she had health problems and couldn't testify. He apparently knew I was coming, but he still said, "What are you doing here?" Carrie Hirth was another witness that wanted to testify on behalf of her father, and she was, I'll say, whipsawed back and forth. Finally did get to testify, but he used her name and said, "We didn't allow Carrie Hirth to testify, so we're going to be consistent, and you won't be allowed to testify either." And I opened my mouth to answer, and then they cut my mic off, and he said there'd be no rebuttal, something to that effect. And they also, the utilities staff told me that this is a court of law, and you must treat it as such. This isn't a court of law. I've been in lots of courts of law. I've written a fair amount of law, and I've sat through the Supreme Court and at every level, by the way. That's not a court of law. They pose as a court of law. It isn't even a court of logic. How does this play out? All right, so from this point on, then it looks to me like we work all the legislation we can, stall the things as much as we can. We're going to have more power in each legislature going forward, but also it starts where filings within the district court. And the due process is one that should be the cleanest one with regard to Don and Carol Hennings and the Hennings Family Trust, that when they refused to allow me to testify, they refused her to have representation. The law requires an opportunity for her to do that. That actually should be a slam dunk. Now, how it gets determined, though, do they remand it back and say, hold a new hearing? Or do they say, oh, you go ahead and have your say in this courtroom and we'll put it into the record? I don't think that's going to happen. But some of that litigation is going to take place. I want to be, of course, behind all of those things that have due process arguments on it, and there are quite a few of them. We have the Iowa legislative interveners. Now that number is up in the upper 30s somewhere that have signed on, and that group is now led by Representative Charlie Thompson, who is also an attorney and a terrific guy, by the way, a wise man and a good strategic fellow thinker too. So those things are going to emerge from that, some litigation from that. You'll see litigation from the Sierra Club, that's almost automatic. You'll see litigation from the Geordie Group, which is, I suppose in Iowa, it's something like 250 landowners have signed up with that attorney firm. There are others in the Dakotas, etc. So those firms will also file. For our part here, we've formed a couple corporations. Free Soil Foundation is a 501c3. And that's to raise attorney fees so we can defend these landowners in court. And the other one is Land of the Free Action, and that's a C4. And we've used that to raise money to hire a lobbyist, which the last legislative session we had a lobbyist there all the time. And what I'm looking to is this path to the Supreme Court. Now, it's possible that the Iowa Supreme Court could put the kibosh to this, because the language in the Iowa Supreme Court mirrors the Fifth Amendment in the U.S. the language in the Iowa Constitution mirrors the U.S. Constitution, Fifth Amendment, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. I want to point out, too, that the framers of our Constitution didn't say private interests can't take private property with or without just compensation. They didn't bother to say that. It was outside the concept of their very deep and futuristic thinking. They just thought government might confiscate property, so they wanted to make sure it was for public use. So it just goes without saying that private doesn't take private for private use. But the Iowa Constitution is not encumbered by the Kelo decision, is my point. And so I think that the final phase of this ends up the United States Supreme Court. And when I look at that court, it's at least a 6-3 decision to uphold our property rights. And I know that the left, if anybody remembers Barney Frank from Massachusetts, he was the most liberal member of the U.S. Congress when I was there. Barney Frank and I agreed exactly on the property rights issue of Kelo. So the left is there with us. We might get a decision on Kelo on our side of this thing from the 3 liberal members of the court. But the non-liberal members of the court, the more pure constitutionalists, I would put it that way, Some of them are salivating at the opportunity to reverse kilo because they know what a disaster it is. I was a former chairman of the Conservative Opportunity Society. I hosted a breakfast every Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock for 16 years of that. I'd invited Justice Scalia to come to that breakfast. Within a week of the kilo decision, man, that's real close anyway, and that was the topic that we wanted to talk about. And I remember, I'll never forget the look in his eye. He had really dark, intense eyes, and terrific sense of humor, by the way. I love the guy. But he sat across that table, and when I talked to him about the kilo decision, he said straight out, he said, "It is an erroneous decision, and it will be reversed one day." And so that's been also something that's fueled me. And that look in his eye kind of spoke to my soul. And he's gone now. And I want to do my part to honor what Scalia'd like to see.